we had sort of an unintended experiment in the last year or two in bringing in many, many, many new workers. We usually have around 900,000. You think about that as normal, 900,000 net immigration. 2022 was about 2.6 million, and
Mhm.
CBO says 2023 was about 3.3 million. And CBO, in their latest economic and budget update, in their long-term outlook, said, we think that increased immigration is responsible, partially anyway, for the fact that we didn't have a recession in the last year. Everybody was expecting one. CBO said that immigration boost really added about 7 trillion to their GDP forecast over the next 10 years and about $1 trillion in revenue. So it wasn't intended. Nobody said, hey, let's see what happens if we, triple immigration. But the economic positive, the beneficial positive economic effects were shown in the numbers. We didn't do it intentionally, but this
Yeah.
is kind of, I take it to be an interesting experiment.
Well, it's interesting because CBO is sort of the first government agency or any economic agency to really look at the number of arrivals we've seen at the border over the last several years and look at it from an economic standpoint. Obviously, we've already talked about how it's a structural problem for our border and for managing things. But what they did that, say, Census Bureau hasn't done or Social Security trustees didn't do when they started looking at workforce and population projections is CBO went to Department of Homeland Security and said, tell us about how many people have been admitted to the country and in what status. So they're the first government agency that included what they call this other worker category. So they were looking not just at legal immigration, which, as you mentioned, has been around net about 900,000 a year average before COVID. COVID dropped it
Yeah.
substantially. But we rebounded our legal immigration and added these numbers from the border. And they said that, they're estimating because of this bump, there will be 5.2 million more people in 2033 than they had projected last year in 2023. An increase of about 2.7% in the labor force, which is important. And most of this is coming from this other category. And so if you look at the people who've been arriving at the border, the ones who have been processed to wait an immigration case in immigration court, they're, I would say, quasi-legally here, right? The government has processed them. They're in a process to determine if they get to stay, but they may not get legal work authorization for months or years down the line if they do. And some others have been paroled in, so they might get more immediate work authorization. There's a lot of different statuses. My colleagues over at the Migration Policy Institute call them liminal status because it's not a formal green card. It's not even a temporary visa with specific terms and conditions. It is this amorphous sort of limbo state where you're waiting on some other government agency to decide. So one of the things we don't know is whether or how many of these people will ultimately remain in the United States. And that's one reason why CBO didn't predict that this number would continue. They said after a couple of years, we're just going to revert to the mean because geez, we don't know what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, right.
Which is, I guess that's about as good as you can guess. But, if we wanted our immigration system to really have this economic impact, we'd want these people to have a more permanent status, right? We'd want them to have a green card or some other status that enables them to be fully embedded in the economic market in the United States, working at their full potential, definitely working above board. And one of the things CBO said is, we're estimating that almost all of these people are going to work within 6 months, whether they have authorization or not, right?
Yeah.
So they're saying, look, people aren't going to sit around on their hands. They can't collect benefits. They're going to find a way to work, whether that's legally or not. So it's important to recognize that everybody who participates in the labor market is supporting our economic growth. But from an immigration policy perspective, it will be far better if they were here on a permanent legal status.